Hey guys, tonight we're diving into a topic that's as mysterious as it is fascinating. Why medieval iron never rusted, while your shiny new bike or that garden shovel you just bought will probably start corroding by next year. Sounds unbelievable, right? After all, we're talking about centuries-old metal, forged with the kind of tools you probably wouldn't trust to hold up your IKEA bookshelf. And yet, their iron, often older than your grandmother, would withstand the test of time, sometimes even centuries, while today's iron and steel seem to rust as soon as you leave them out in the rain. Now, you probably won't survive tonight's journey without a few curious thoughts creeping into your head about how we've messed up with modern technology. You might also wonder why we're still struggling with such a basic problem as rust when people in the past seem to have figured it out. But hey, let's take it slow. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'm genuinely curious where you're listening from tonight, too. Drop your location and the time you're tuning in. I love knowing where this little history journey is reaching. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. To kick things off, let's talk about the thing we're all probably taking for granted right now: rust. Or, more precisely, the lack of it in medieval iron. You might be sitting there thinking, okay, iron doesn't rust. What's the big deal? But here's the thing. For the medieval people, it was a big deal. In fact, their survival often hinged on it. Iron tools, weapons, and armor, crucial for day-to-day survival, had to be durable. What's more, they didn't have any of the fancy anti-corrosion coatings or modern alloys we rely on today. So how do they manage? The answer lies in something far more complex than a little bit of rust-proofing paint. Historians still argue whether the medieval blacksmiths knew exactly why their iron didn't rust, or if it was simply the product of trial and error. But one thing is for sure, they were masters of an ancient craft. Medieval iron wasn't just any iron. It was made using a process called bloomery smelting. This method, which had been perfected over centuries, produced iron that was far purer than the mass-produced iron of today. The bloomery method involved smelting iron ore in a furnace, but unlike modern processes, it didn't melt the iron into a liquid. Instead, the furnace produced a spongy mass, called a bloom, that was hammered and purified over hours, sometimes days. This created a metal that was high in carbon, giving it an unusual structure and making it tougher, more durable, and less likely to corrode. But it wasn't just the technique that made the difference. It was the materials used in the process. You see, medieval iron smelters knew something we've mostly forgotten today. They had access to high-quality ores and fuel sources that produced far cleaner metal. This meant there was less slag and fewer impurities in the iron, making it more resistant to rust in the long term. Of course, they didn't have microscopes to see the tiny details at the atomic level, but they knew what worked. And by working with what nature gave them, they were able to produce iron that could withstand the elements better than anything we make today. But what else were they doing behind the scenes to keep that iron intact? You're still here, good. Because now that you got a sense of just how weirdly resilient medieval iron was, it's time to step back even further into the smoke-filled world of ancient smelting. Picture yourself standing in front of a furnace, the kind that looks more like a giant clay beehive than a piece of industrial equipment. The air tastes metallic, the heat licks at your cheeks, and your clothes cling to you with the weight of ash. You hear the rhythmic clang of hammers in the background, blacksmiths testing the day's bloom, shaping history with every strike. What they were really doing was chemistry, long before chemistry had a name. The process of smelting iron ore into usable metal was part science, part sorcery, and all sweat. Unlike modern blast furnaces, which run at temperatures high enough to melt skyscrapers, ancient smelters operated at relatively low heat. Inside those clay furnaces, charcoal, not coal, not coke, burned as the main fuel, and the air was pumped by bellows, sometimes operated by foot, sometimes by a team of exhausted apprentices. The key was in the oxygen, or rather, in its absence. Too much air, and the iron ore would oxidize again into useless rust. Too little, and the ore wouldn't reduce to metal at all. It was a delicate balance, one achieved through endless repetition and the kind of intuitive skill you can't teach from textbook. The result? A lump of raw, metallic sponge called a bloom. This bloom was a messy tangle of iron and slag, still glowing orange from heat, and it took hours of hammering to beat the impurities out. Now, here's the historical fact for tonight. The earliest known iron smelting dates back to around 1200 BCE in regions like Anatolia and sub-Saharan Africa. The Hittites are often credited as the pioneers of iron smelting, though historians still argue whether they were truly first or merely the best at marketing their metal. Either way, by the time medieval Europe came along, smelting had become an art form. Here's a quirky tidbit. In some parts of Europe, smelters actually added bones. Yes, animal bones, into their furnaces. The calcium in the bones helped to flux the slag, making it easier to separate from the iron. So if you ever find yourself examining a medieval sword and wondering what gave it that faint pearly sheen, well, it might just be a ghost of someone's dinner. Smelters in different regions developed their own recipes, and that's where things got really interesting. Northern Europe used bog iron ore that literally formed in swamps, as a raw material. It was full of organic compounds that, when smelted, produced tiny inclusions of phosphorus. That phosphorus, as it turns out, made the iron not only tougher, but also more resistant to rust. So that dull, slightly yellowish medieval nail, found by archaeologists, it's not corroded, it's just seasoned. And here's where the twist comes in. While we tend to think of modernity as progress, in this case, it's almost the opposite. When blast furnaces arrived in the 14th and 15th centuries, they revolutionized iron production. Suddenly, you could make tons of metal fast. But quantity came at the cost of quality. The carbon content became inconsistent, impurities crept in, and the pure, rust-resistant bloomery iron started to disappear from history. Still, there's something oddly poetic about those early furnaces. Imagine the glow of molten metal lighting up a forest clearing, sparks drifting into the night like fireflies. The smell of charcoal, hot iron, and damp earth all mixing into something you can't quite describe. And there you are, standing at the edge, maybe with a stick in hand, pretending you understand what's going on while secretly just enjoying the heat. You might be thinking, okay, so medieval people were better smelters than us. Big deal. But hang on, there's more to this. Their mastery of smelting wasn't just about making iron. It was about controlling nature itself. They turned raw earth into something indestructible. That's why pieces of medieval ironwork, gates, swords, anchors, can survive hundreds of years buried in damp soil. One theory suggests that the bloomery process left microscopic layers of slag and carbon sealed within the iron. These acted like natural barriers, keeping oxygen and moisture from penetrating too deeply. Think of it like medieval Tupperware. Crude, maybe, but surprisingly effective at keeping things fresh. Historians still argue whether these slag layers were intentional or just happy accidents of the process. But either way, the result was the same: iron that lasted. So next time you see an old iron hinge on a castle door, dark and rough but still solid, know that it's not magic, it's metallurgy. And somewhere, deep down, you can almost hear the blacksmiths laughing at us as we spray our patio furniture with rust remover for the 5th time this year. The ancient smelters may not have had our factories, but they had something else: a hands-on intimacy with their craft. They listened to the furnace breathe. They read the color of the flame. They could tell when the iron was right just by the pitch of the hammer strike. You, standing there centuries later, would have no idea what you were looking at. To them, it was second nature. And when they finally pulled that glowing bloom from the fire, sparks swirling like tiny stars, they weren't just making metal. They were shaping the backbone of civilization itself. All right, let's keep rolling through time, because the journey's about to take a turn into the mysterious world of preservation. Here's where things get really fascinating. While medieval iron might have been tougher and purer than anything we're cranking out today, there's something else that made it last longer, and it wasn't just the forging. It was how they treated that metal once it was in their hands. Spoiler alert, medieval blacksmiths didn't just stick their new tools out in the rain and hope for the best. No, they knew exactly how to keep the rust at bay, and it wasn't with fancy chemicals or modern coatings. They had something far simpler but oddly effective. You see, medieval people had a sneaky trick up their sleeves. They used natural preservatives. Sure, we're talking about things like oils, beeswax, and, of all things, animal fats. That's right, beeswax and fat, which sound more like ingredients for a medieval breakfast than a rust-proofing solution, were actually the key to keeping their iron from oxidizing. It's kind of like how you're probably rubbing your own hands with moisturizing lotion to prevent them from drying out in the winter, except this lotion was for metal. This technique was well known, particularly in the maritime world. Medieval sailors, those adventurous souls who spent most of their time navigating the open seas, couldn't afford to let their ships and tools rust away. Salt water is notorious for speeding up corrosion, and while most of us probably think about salt water as something to avoid when it comes to metal, these sailors had figured out how to protect their ships using a combination of oils and natural waxes. They would slather these onto iron surfaces, sometimes mixing in resin from trees or tars from wood fires. This created a kind of waterproofing barrier that slowed the rusting process down. Sure, it wasn't a perfect solution. Salt water still did its best to sneak through, but it worked far better than you might imagine. Historians still argue whether the use of tars and oils was a widespread practice across all maritime cultures, or whether it was specific to certain regions. But there's evidence pointing to the fact that, at least in the Mediterranean, ships and their iron parts were routinely treated with oils derived from olive trees. And in other parts of Europe, tars from pine forests were a common protective coating for iron. It wasn't just about waterproofing, though. The oils and fats acted as physical shields, slowing the iron's exposure to the elements and giving it an extra layer of protection. On land, blacksmiths also used oils and waxes on swords and other weapons to keep them from rusting, though they took things a step further by making sure the metal was kept oiled at all times. Think of it as a medieval version of car waxing, but with far more permanence and purpose. These oils were often mixed with other substances, like ash or soot, to create a thick coating that would last longer and be more effective in repelling water. And while this method might seem a bit crude to us, it was actually incredibly effective. But the craziest part? The medieval smiths weren't doing it just for the aesthetic of shiny armor. They knew rust wasn't just a surface problem. It could completely destroy the integrity of the metal. If rust took hold in the wrong places, you could lose your weapon, tool, or ship, potentially costing lives. So they took a pretty no-nonsense approach to preservation. They didn't just know about rust, they feared it. Let's add a little quirk here. Consider that one of the best natural rust preventatives they used came from seals. Yes, the fat of seals, which was often harvested and processed for multiple uses, would be rubbed into the iron to form a protective barrier. It sounded a bit like something out of a weird historical survival show, but it worked. Seals, with their thick, blubbery skin, produce oils that are surprisingly resilient against water and oxidation. By using seal fat on their tools, blacksmiths created a kind of natural rust-proofing agent that could easily withstand the harshest conditions of sea and land alike. Today, you might think of those kinds of old-school techniques as bizarre or unsophisticated, but in their world, they were incredibly effective. In fact, this kind of preservation knowledge was passed down through generations, almost like a secret trade, shared by master blacksmiths and sailors alike. Sure, we've come up with advanced coatings and industrial rust-proofing today, but when you stop and think about it, there's something almost more satisfying about the old ways. A little bit of oil, a little bit of time, and suddenly you've got iron that stays iron, just like it's supposed to. What wild about all of this is how we've kind of forgotten these natural methods over time. With the rise of mass production and synthetic materials, we've become obsessed with the latest and greatest chemicals, tougher alloys, longer-lasting coatings, and industrial coatings with names you can't pronounce. But you can't help but wonder, are we missing something? Could we learn a thing or two from the old-school preservers of iron, who seem to have everything figured out? Historians still argue whether these oils and fats were the reason medieval iron didn't rust. After all, they were used in conjunction with other methods, like the careful shaping and smelting of the metal. But one thing's for sure, the combination of artistry, nature, and practical preservation techniques gave them a leg up. That knowledge was passed down from generation to generation, hidden in the process of blacksmithing, until the industrial age swept it all away. All right, now that we've gone deep into the world of preservation techniques, let's take a step back and talk about the real heart of medieval ironworking, the art of forging itself. You might picture a grizzled blacksmith hammering away at a glowing piece of iron, sparks flying with every blow, but it wasn't just brute force and fire. No, the magic came from the rhythm, the almost hypnotic dance between metal and hammer, heat and precision. When you think about it, the medieval blacksmiths had to be more than just metal workers. They were true artisans. Forging iron wasn't a quick process. It could take hours to craft a single weapon or tool, with the metal being heated to glowing temperatures again and again, hammered and folded, hammered and folded. With each strike, the blacksmith wasn't just shaping the metal. They were literally changing its internal structure. They were coaxing the iron into a specific kind of hardness, a toughness that we now associate with legendary swords like the Viking Ulfbert or the iconic English longsword. These weapons weren't just tools. They were the product of generations of refinement and painstaking care. But here's the thing. That constant process of heating and hammering had a side effect that made medieval iron incredibly resistant to rust. It created a unique texture on the metal surface. The intense pressure from hammering the metal, coupled with the cooling and reheating cycles, helped to form a thin, crystalline structure on the surface that was resistant to the penetration of moisture and oxygen. In essence, it was like the metal had its own natural protective shell, one forged over hours, not with chemicals or coatings, but with heat, pressure, and time. Historians still argue whether the metal's unique crystalline structure was fully understood by the blacksmiths of the time. Some believe they simply trusted in the process and knew that the longer they worked with the metal, the better it would perform. Others think that blacksmiths might have known about the science behind the process all along. Either way, it's clear that the act of forging wasn't just about making something functional. It was about crafting a work of art, an object that could withstand the test of time, not just in terms of use but durability. Let's get into a quirky little tidbit here. Did you know that the crackling sound you hear when metal is struck in the forge is actually the release of gases that were trapped in the iron during the smelting process? Those sounds aren't just ambient noise. They're part of the way iron breathes as it goes through its transformation. The more cracks and pops you hear, the purer the iron. It's kind of like listening to the song of metal as it finds its form. Forging wasn't just limited to weapons, either. In fact, some of the most famous ironwork we associate with the Middle Ages, like gates, armor, or tools, was also made using this exact technique. A blacksmith might spend days crafting a single decorative wrought iron gate for a noble family, hammering it into intricate shapes, forming spirals, and curling loops. The process of hammering and folding the metal helped remove any impurities and made the final product stronger and less prone to damage. In a sense, each strike was adding an extra layer of protection. But unlike our modern factories, which churn out millions of mass-produced pieces, medieval blacksmiths were creating items that were personalized, durable, and built to last. They weren't cutting corners. One of the best examples of this process is the famous Damascus steel, which originated in the Near East but spread throughout Europe during the Middle Ages. This steel, known for its beautiful, flowing patterns on the surface, was the result of centuries of experimentation with smelting, forging, and folding techniques. The process involved repeatedly folding layers of iron with carbon-rich materials, like charcoal or organic matter, creating a steel that was stronger, more flexible, and less prone to rust than most metals of the time. The secret behind Damascus steel was a finely honed understanding of metallurgy that allowed blacksmiths to produce swords with incredible sharpness, toughness, and rust resistance. Historians still argue about exactly how the blacksmiths of the medieval world achieved this mysterious effect, with some suggesting it was the result of using specific types of ore, while others believe it was the result of a particular forging technique. There are even debates about whether the famous Damascus pattern was purely aesthetic or whether it also had functional benefits in terms of strength and rust resistance. Either way, there's no denying that medieval ironworkers were way ahead of their time when it came to creating metal that could stand up to the elements. And this whole idea of a metal that could resist rust wasn't limited to just swords and weapons. The entire economy and infrastructure of medieval Europe relied on this strong, resilient iron. Blacksmiths provided essential tools for agriculture, for construction, for everyday life. Iron nails held together houses. Iron plows helped farmers till the earth. Iron was the backbone of nearly everything that kept the medieval world ticking. But without that rust resistance, none of it would have lasted as long as it did. It's not just about the beauty of medieval weapons or the intricacy of wrought iron gates. It's about the very fact that the iron was built to endure. And yet, despite all of this, we still don't fully understand the depths of medieval ironworking. We've found fragments of their techniques, some in ancient texts, others preserved in the ironwork itself, but much of the process has been lost to time. While modern blacksmiths have rediscovered many of these methods, there's still that nagging feeling that we're missing something. Perhaps it's not just the techniques, but a certain spirit of ironworking that we've lost in our rush to modernize and mass-produce. We've figured out how to make iron more efficient, but somehow we've forgotten how to make it last. Now that you've got a handle on the magic behind medieval forging, it's time to step into a world of scarcity. You've probably heard of the Iron Age, but what you might not realize is that the world of medieval iron wasn't exactly a world of plenty. Far from it. In fact, while we may take iron for granted today, medieval people knew that iron was a precious resource, one that could make or break entire civilizations. If you didn't have good iron, you didn't have good tools, good weapons, or good construction materials. And if your iron supply ran dry, well, you were in serious trouble. Now, imagine being a blacksmith in the middle of the 12th century. You're not strolling down to the hardware store for a shiny new ingot of iron. No, you're relying on local sources of ore. If the local mines run out, you have to start looking further afield, maybe across dangerous mountain passes, maybe even through foreign lands. Worse still, sometimes entire regions went through iron shortages due to overuse or a lack of available resources. It wasn't just a matter of getting more iron. It was about protecting what you had, and that meant getting creative. That's where innovation kicked in. You see, during times of scarcity, blacksmiths and ironworkers didn't just throw up their hands and give up. They started to think outside the box. In some regions, particularly in Europe, iron was so valuable that people developed methods of recycling iron from old weapons, tools, and even buildings. Instead of letting an old sword rust away in a shed, blacksmiths would melt it down, hammer out the impurities, and reforge it into something new. This process, called recycling, was more than just thrifty. It was necessary for survival. One of the more famous examples of this comes from the Vikings, who had to constantly deal with a limited supply of iron in the cold, harsh lands of Scandinavia. They would reuse old iron from previous battles, repurposing it into weapons, tools, and even jewelry. This wasn't just a way to save money. It was a matter of resourcefulness. In a world where every weapon, every plow, every nail mattered, wasting iron was almost as bad as wasting food. Historians still argue whether Viking ironworkers were consciously recycling iron for economic or strategic reasons, or if it was just a practical necessity born out of scarcity. Some suggest that their impressive swords, like the famous Ulfbert sword, may have been forged using older iron, melted down, and reforged with new techniques to make them stronger. And while those swords might have been strong, they still had the same rust resistance as the iron they were made from. thanks to the techniques we've already discussed. But here's the kicker. This scarcity didn't just affect the common folk. It also put the nobility in a difficult position. Knights, lords, and kings needed iron for everything from armor to fortifications, and they had to fight over limited resources just like everyone else. Iron was so valuable that it became a commodity, and there were times when entire kingdoms fought over the right to mine it. In the 12th century, for example, when the Kingdom of England needed a steady supply of iron to fuel its growing military machine, conflicts arose with neighboring France, who had rich deposits of iron ore. This led to some serious geopolitical maneuvering. Iron wasn't just a resource, it was a weapon. Kings and rulers realized that control over iron production meant control over the power to wage war. A shortage of good iron could spell disaster for an army, especially one that relied heavily on iron armor and weapons. So, in a world where iron was already scarce, shortages only made it more precious, and the fight for it more intense. But let's pause for a second, because there's a quirk here that's almost too bizarre to believe. In medieval times, there was actually a sort of iron diplomacy happening. If two neighboring regions were competing for the same iron sources, one might try to outsmart the other by hoarding iron from their own mines, using clever methods like secret iron storage, or even destroying metalworks to prevent it from getting into enemy hands. This wasn't just about war, it was about the long-term survival of a kingdom. So, while medieval kings were jockeying for power and land, they were also playing an iron game of survival. The more iron you controlled, the more power you had, and rusting into irrelevance wasn't an option. On a more practical level, these shortages of iron also pushed the boundaries of ironworking itself. The limitations of available materials forced blacksmiths to improve their craft, leading to innovations in alloying. For instance, blacksmiths began mixing iron with small amounts of other metals, like carbon, to create early forms of steel. This process led to the creation of high-carbon steel, which, while prone to rust like all metals, was much harder, sharper, and more durable. And while the steel produced during the medieval period wasn't perfect, it laid the groundwork for the steel that would come centuries later during the Industrial Revolution. Now, there's an interesting debate among historians about whether the scarcity of iron in the medieval period was truly a crisis or just part of a natural cycle. Some argue that it was just a phase in the long arc of iron history, an ebb and flow in the availability of natural resources. Others claim that these shortages contributed to the eventual decline of certain medieval empires, where iron, once abundant, became a valuable commodity that was no longer easily accessible. What's undeniable, though, is how these iron shortages shaped history. They pushed human creativity, inspired strategic thinking, and revolutionized the craft of blacksmithing. By the time the Middle Ages gave way to the Renaissance, blacksmiths had developed techniques that allowed iron to last longer, resist corrosion better, and be used in a variety of ways that earlier blacksmiths would never have imagined. They created the very foundation of civilization that we still rely on today, from the iron nails that hold our houses together to the steel beams that support our skyscrapers. In the end, scarcity might have forced the medieval world to make the most of their iron, but it was the blacksmith's ingenuity and resourcefulness that truly allowed iron to outlast centuries of wear and tear. And while the wars over iron resources might have been fierce, the real battle was always in the forge, where metal, fire, and human skill came together to make something that could endure the ravages of time. By now, you're probably starting to notice a pattern emerging. Medieval ironworkers weren't just dealing with iron. They were facing challenges that we now call resource management, technological innovation, and, dare I say, supply chain issues. And let's face it, in a world where not only was the iron hard to come by, but the tools to work with it were limited, things got really interesting. Especially when we shift from how they made it to what they made. And that's when you realize medieval blacksmiths weren't just making swords, they were making the whole infrastructure of civilization. Let's take a moment to talk about a humble yet remarkably important piece of medieval ironwork, the nail. Yes, the nail. It might not sound thrilling at first, but think about it. Without iron nails, your whole world would be a lot more flammable. Medieval houses, ships, even cathedrals. All these structures needed nails to stay intact. And without a reliable supply of iron nails, it would have been impossible to build the monuments, towns, and castles that define our image of the medieval world. But here's the twist. Making iron nails was a major production in the medieval period. Blacksmiths didn't just casually throw a few nails together as an afterthought. No, nails were vital, and the process of making them was labor-intensive, requiring precision, skill, and more than a bit of patience. You've probably seen the kinds of nails we use today. Smooth, perfectly cylindrical, and mass-produced. Medieval nails, however, had a distinctive look. They were often hand-forged, with flat, square heads and tapered shafts. Each nail was made individually by hammering a small piece of iron into a specific shape before cutting it to the desired length. What's remarkable is that, despite how seemingly simple a nail is, it required significant mastery to get it right. In fact, medieval blacksmiths often specialized in nail-making, becoming experts in the craft. They would heat a small iron rod in the forge, hammer it into a square shape, and then cut it to size with a special tool. The nails were then used to hold wooden planks together, whether it was for roofing, doors, or walls. The quality of a nail could determine the integrity of a building. Get it wrong, and you had an unstable structure. And of course, nails weren't just used for buildings. They were key to shipbuilding too. Imagine trying to build a ship without nails to hold the planks together. You couldn't. Iron nails, carefully made and meticulously hammered in, were the backbone of medieval construction. Let's get quirky here for a second. The use of nails in shipbuilding was so vital that there are reports of medieval shipbuilders taking nails with them when they went on long journeys. These nails weren't just tools. They were a form of security. A ship with a steady supply of nails could be repaired mid-journey, should the need arise. Some shipbuilders even kept a stash of nails specifically for emergency repairs, knowing full well that a boat without nails wouldn't stay afloat for long. Historians still debate whether medieval builders were fully aware of the structural importance of the nails they used, or whether it was more of a trial-and-error learning process. Some claim that, over time, builders understood the relationship between the quality of nails and the durability of their structures. Others suggest it was less about conscious design and more about the accumulated knowledge passed down through generations of artisans. Either way, the fact remains, medieval iron nails were an unsung hero of the era. And while we're on the subject of medieval infrastructure, let's talk about the nail's more glamorous cousin, the sword. While the humble nail held together houses and ships, the sword held together the notion of status and power. Swords were the shining example of medieval blacksmithing at its most prestigious, and they were crafted with as much care and attention to detail as the most precious of artifacts. Medieval swords, particularly those crafted in the 11th to 14th centuries, were built to last. Some of these swords, especially famous blades like the Ulfbert, were made with a high degree of carbon content, resulting in steel that could take and hold a razor-sharp edge. But the real secret was in the forging process. The blades of these swords were repeatedly folded and hammered, much like the process used to make Damascus steel. Each fold served to eliminate impurities and create an incredibly strong, flexible blade. The folding process also created unique patterns in the steel, which not only gave the sword a stunning appearance, but added to its strength by diffusing stresses along the blade. Historians still argue about how much of the actual forging process for swords was based on trial and error, or if there was a more scientific understanding at play. Some argue that the best swordsmiths might have intuitively known how the heat, folding, and hammering affected the final product, while others point to evidence that suggests they were deeply aware of the metallurgical science involved. Either way, swords from this period became the epitome of medieval craftsmanship, symbols of wealth, and weapons of choice in battle. And they were built to last. Many surviving blades, centuries later, still hold an edge sharp enough to cut through modern steel. But here's the kicker. Despite all this skill, the swords weren't invincible. After all, they were still metal, and metal, as we've learned, has a tendency to rust. So, What kept these blades from degrading? More often than not, it was the care they received from their owners. Most knights and warriors kept their blades oiled and wrapped in cloth to keep the rust at bay, just like we might store a tool in a dry, safe place today. While medieval metallurgy was impressive, they still had to protect their investment with proper maintenance. And that brings us back to the eternal struggle against rust. The very things that made medieval iron so durable. Careful smelting, hammering, folding also helped mitigate the wear and tear of oxidation. You could have the best sword in the world, but if you left it out in the rain without oiling it, it'd be toast. Whether it was the humble nail or the gleaming sword, the key was in maintenance. Iron wasn't invincible. It had to be tended to, kept clean, oiled, and protected to retain its strength. So, the next time you pick up a sword, or even a nail, if you happen to have one lying around, think about the centuries of craftsmanship, resourcefulness, and plain old human ingenuity that went into making these items last. Iron wasn't just forged in the fire. It was forged in the minds of those who knew how to make it last. We've been taking quite a journey through the medieval world of iron, haven't we? From forges to battles, from nails to swords, and everything in between, it's clear that iron played an irreplaceable role in shaping civilization. But what about the everyday person? The common folk who weren't knights or blacksmiths? How do they experience the wonders of medieval iron? And what does that tell us about the wider societal impact of this incredibly versatile material? You might think that only the rich and powerful had access to fine iron tools and weapons, but that's not entirely true. While it's easy to imagine medieval society as a place where only nobles and knights used quality iron, the reality is much more layered. Iron tools were essential to the daily lives of peasants and tradespeople too. Whether it was a farmer using an iron plow to till the soil, a carpenter shaping wooden beams with iron tools, or a woman cooking over an iron stove, the common people of the medieval world also benefited from the ingenuity of the blacksmith. In fact, the rise of iron was closely tied to the rise of medieval agriculture and craftsmanship. Take farming, for instance. Medieval agriculture was extremely labor-intensive, and without the right tools, a farmer's life would have been considerably harder. The plow was the game-changer here. Before the widespread use of iron in plows, farmers had to rely on wooden plows, which simply didn't work well in tougher soils. The introduction of iron into plows gave farmers the ability to till land much more efficiently, making them less dependent on the fickle weather. Iron-fitted plows could break through tough, compacted earth, allowing for larger crop yields, which, in turn, supported the growing population. The transition to iron-plated plows wasn't just about making work easier. It was about increasing productivity. A farmer could work more land in less time, which contributed to the growth of local economies and made surplus food more common. This increase in agricultural production led to the rise of market towns, which in turn sparked the growth of trade and commerce. And with trade came more demand for iron goods, tools, weapons, cookware, nails, and other everyday essentials. Iron became the backbone of economic growth in the medieval period. But this increased demand for iron came with its own challenges. It wasn't just about producing iron. It was about distributing it. As more people started to rely on iron tools, the pressure on blacksmiths and metalworkers increased. In some areas, a shortage of iron could mean the difference between life and death for a village or town. A single broken plow in a farming community, for example, could mean the difference between a successful harvest and famine. It's almost like today, when a single broken part in a modern factory can cause massive production delays. In medieval times, the whole village depended on the blacksmith skill to keep things running smoothly. Historians still debate the exact impact of these iron-driven changes on the medieval peasant class. Some argue that the increase in productivity made life easier for common folk, improving their standard of living and giving them access to more food and resources. Others suggest that the spread of iron tools only deepened the divide between the wealthy landowners and the laborers, as those with more money could afford the best tools, while the poorest were stuck with subpar equipment. But one thing is certain. Iron helped shape the way people worked, lived, and interacted in ways we still feel today. Let's zoom out for a second and consider a quirky fact that might make you rethink your image of medieval life. Medieval people didn't just use iron for utilitarian purposes, they also used it for superstition. You know how today we think of a lucky penny or carry-around charms to ward off bad luck? Well, the medieval world had its own set of iron-related superstitions. Iron was thought to have magical properties, a belief that might sound strange but was rooted in the material's power and resilience. In some regions, people believed that iron could ward off evil spirits or charm away bad luck. Iron was seen as a powerful substance because of its strength, because it could be shaped and molded, and because it was forged in fire, an element thought to be linked to the divine. Iron amulets were worn as protection, and iron horseshoes were hung over doorways to keep away witches or demons. You know those little metal charms you sometimes see hanging in windows today, meant to protect the home from bad energy? Well, that's basically the modern evolution of medieval iron superstition. One particularly fun example comes from the belief that iron could ward off fairies. If you were a child in medieval Britain, for example, your parents might have placed a small iron token or nail under your pillow to protect you from mischievous fairies who could kidnap babies. That little piece of iron was thought to create a barrier between the child and the fairy world, because, apparently, fairies could be really into iron. It's funny, right? But it shows just how much medieval people revered the power of iron. After all, it wasn't just about its practicality. It was about the mystique of a material that seemed to control the forces of nature. Of course, this mystical perception of iron also ties back to its scarcity and value. In a world where iron was precious, anything rare or difficult to obtain carried an aura of mystery. The act of forging iron was a kind of alchemy, turning raw materials from the earth into something stronger than the sum of its parts. And that transformation, whether in a sword, a nail, or a horseshoe, became synonymous with the idea of control. Iron was something that humans could master, that they could shape and bend to their will. It was no wonder that medieval minds saw it as a tool of both practical use and mystical power. Historians still argue whether these superstitions played a real role in medieval life, or whether they were more symbolic expressions of the power and mystery that iron held. But the fact remains that iron wasn't just a material. It was a symbol of strength, control, and protection. As we bring this section to a close, let's think about this. Iron has a way of transcending the purely physical. It isn't just the material that makes a plow work, or a sword sharp, or a nail hold house together. It's the cultural meaning we've attached to it. This substance that is both humble and powerful, mundane and magical. And even though we don't often think about it today, iron is still at the heart of so much that surrounds us. From the bridges we cross to the tools we use, iron, and the traditions of its crafting, remain embedded in the foundation of our modern world. By now, you might be thinking, all right, so iron was important, but why all this talk about superstition and ancient plows? What does that have to do with the rusting iron in my toolbox? Well, bear with me because it's time to zoom out and look at the bigger picture. The reason medieval iron didn't rust away like your backyard nails or a modern car's undercarriage boils down to a blend of craftsmanship, environment, and most importantly, how iron was treated. And just like the ancient belief in the magical powers of iron, there's more to it than meets the eye. First, let's talk about the concept of rust because you probably think you understand it. But the real story is much more interesting than the simple iron plus water equals rust equation we're all taught in school. Rust, scientifically speaking, is the result of an oxidation reaction where iron reacts with oxygen and moisture in the environment to form iron oxide. Now, this is a natural process. It's how metals corrode when exposed to air and water. But what most people don't realize is that the rate at which iron rusts isn't just determined by how much oxygen or moisture is present. It's also influenced by the way the metal is processed and coated during its creation. Think back to those medieval blacksmiths we've been talking about. It turns out they had a trick up their sleeves that helped prevent their ironwork from deteriorating as quickly as the stuff we deal with today. The key? Patina. This wasn't just a fancy word for an old look, it was a vital protective layer that developed naturally over time. A properly forged piece of iron would develop a thin, rust-like coating that actually protected the metal underneath. This layer was incredibly effective at slowing down the corrosion process and was often left untouched because it was just as protective as any modern coating. In fact, the blacksmiths of the Middle Ages understood, quite intuitively, that the rust they were seeing wasn't always a bad thing. Instead of letting it get out of hand, they would forge the iron in such a way that the first layer of oxidation would form in a way that sealed the metal. Over time, this protected layer, which might look like rust to the untrained eye, became a shield, keeping the deeper metal beneath it from further corrosion. Imagine that the very thing we consider the enemy of iron, rust, was for medieval smiths a defense. It's a strange twist of fate that rust, when managed correctly, could become a tool of preservation. Historians still argue about the exact mechanisms medieval blacksmiths used to achieve this protective patina, with some claiming they had early forms of rust prevention techniques that we didn't discover until much later. The truth? We'll probably never know exactly how they did it, but one thing is clear. The medieval approach to iron was an art that included not just forging, but maintaining. But it's not just about the forging techniques. Let's also take a moment to think about the environmental factors that kept medieval iron from rusting in the same way ours does today. We've already covered how much of the iron in medieval Europe was forged in small-scale, localized furnaces, often in rural areas far from the smog and pollution of urban centers. The lack of industrial pollution and the relatively dry climates in many parts of medieval Europe meant that ironwork was less exposed to the corrosive gases and chemicals that could speed up rusting in modern environments. In fact, the cool, dry air of certain parts of Europe actually helped preserve iron, allowing it to last longer without suffering from the quick rusting that can happen in more humid, polluted areas. Now, let's talk about something most people wouldn't think to associate with iron: water star. Water is, of course, a major factor in rusting. But medieval water management actually played a role in keeping iron intact. Many of the iron workers of the medieval period were based near rivers or other bodies of water, where they could easily access water for their forges. But what's interesting is that the water in these regions, particularly in the more remote and rural areas, was often less corrosive than the water we deal with today. Why? Because the lack of industrial runoff and pollution meant that the water itself didn't carry the same corrosive minerals or chemicals that would speed up the rusting process. The clean, untainted waters of medieval rivers helped keep iron from rusting prematurely, which might explain why so much ironwork from this period has survived through the centuries. This contrasts sharply with the modern world, where we've got acid rain and other pollutants to contend with. In today's cities, the air is often saturated with pollutants like sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxides, which, when combined with moisture, create acid rain. Acid rain accelerates the rusting process, and even if your iron is in relatively good condition, the pollutants in the air can quickly break down protective coatings and hasten the corrosion of the metal. That's why your brand new car might start showing signs of rust after only a few years. Your environment, whether it's the smog of a city or the salty air of a coastal town, is working against you. But, of course, it's not all about the environment or the forging process. You can't ignore the fact that medieval iron was often well-maintained. And by well-maintained, I mean that it was actively cared for in ways we might not expect. We've already touched on the fact that knights, blacksmiths, and farmers took great care to oil and wrap their iron tools, weapons, and armor. They knew that the key to longevity wasn't just about the quality of the iron itself. It was about protecting it from the elements. After all, these were tools that had to last for years, if not decades. People in the Middle Ages had no interest in wasting iron. A rusty sword was a useless sword, and a rusted plow could ruin a harvest. So they took the time to protect their investments. In fact, a surprising number of medieval armory records indicate that soldiers were instructed to regularly oil their swords and armor, sometimes even keeping a dedicated maintenance kit. Much like a modern vehicle needs routine checkups, medieval soldiers needed to keep their gear in fighting shape. This wasn't just superstition, this was practical preservation. Oiling armor, cleaning tools, and wrapping weapons all contributed to a longer lifespan for iron objects. Historians still debate the degree to which regular maintenance played a role in keeping iron from rusting away. Some suggest that it was absolutely crucial to the survival of medieval equipment, while others argue that the sheer quality of medieval ironwork, combined with a favorable environment, was enough to keep corrosion at bay. Either way, one thing's for certain. The more effort that went into caring for iron, the longer it lasted. And while your car might not come with a medieval knight's manual on how to oil it, you've got to admit the medieval method sounds pretty solid. So, the next time you look at a rusty nail or an old piece of iron, remember that medieval blacksmiths were not only shaping metal. They were shaping a philosophy of preservation that relied on craftsmanship, environmental factors, and good old-fashioned care. They didn't just forge iron to last. They forged a culture that treated iron like a valuable resource, one that deserved respect and protection. By now, you've probably realized that the story of medieval iron isn't just a dry lesson in metallurgy. It's a tale of resourcefulness, innovation, and survival. We've talked about the process of forging, the magical patina that protected iron from rust, and the ways medieval societies cared for their iron tools. But there's one more chapter to this tale. How did medieval ironworkers and their creations influence the course of history in ways we're still feeling today? It turns out, iron didn't just make life easier, it revolutionized it. Let's start with the military side of things because, let's face it, medieval iron might have been most famous for its role in warfare. The knights, the armor, the swords, they all symbolized power, status, and the cutting edge of technology in medieval Europe. But it wasn't just about the big battles and grand sieges. It was about how iron made the whole idea of warfare evolve. Medieval knights didn't just ride in a battle with ironclad armor and iron swords. They redefined what it meant to fight a war. You see, before the widespread use of iron armor, soldiers typically fought in leather or padded cloth. Not exactly the stuff of legends, right? But the introduction of iron armor in the 12th century changed the game entirely. Suddenly, knights could withstand blows that would have killed soldiers wearing weaker armor. The shift in technology wasn't just about protection, it was about tactics. With the ability to withstand arrows, swords, and spears, knights were able to engage in more aggressive and organized forms of combat. The combination of iron armor, iron weapons, and the tactical brilliance of medieval generals created a new kind of warfare that shaped European history. But what's even more fascinating is the way medieval ironwork influenced the global scene. You've probably heard about the Crusades, where Western knights traveled to the Middle East. But did you know that the iron used to make their weapons and armor didn't just change the course of European battles? It also had a huge impact on trade and cultural exchange. As European knights and soldiers clashed with the armies of the Middle East, they came into contact with other forms of metallurgy, specifically Damascus steel. The famous swords from the Middle East, known for their strength and distinctive wavy pattern, were made from a type of steel that was far superior to anything found in Europe at the time. Historians still argue about how much influence these encounters had on the development of European ironworking. Some claim that the Western world's exposure to Damascus steel techniques directly influenced the later development of European weaponry, while others suggest that the two styles developed independently. Either way, the exchange of ironworking knowledge between East and West during the Crusades was a huge deal. It was like medieval globalization, and it played a major role in the technological advancement of both regions. But the military uses of iron weren't just about blades and armor. The defensive uses of iron also played a major role in shaping the medieval landscape. Think about castles. You've seen those towering, imposing structures, massive stone walls, fortified gates, and of course, iron gates and portcullises. Iron was essential in castle design, not just for making weapons, but for creating the very defenses that kept invading armies at bay. The thick, reinforced iron gates of castles weren't just decorative, they were survival tools. Without iron, these gates would have been much easier to breach, and the history of medieval sieges might have played out very differently. Speaking of castles, let's not forget that iron wasn't just for the battlefield. In fact, many of the everyday objects that we think of as quintessentially medieval were also made of iron. I'm talking about the locks, hinges, nails, and other bits of hardware that went into constructing castles, homes, and even furniture. Without iron, those castles we associate with fairy tales wouldn't have been possible. They'd have collapsed under the weight of their own stone walls. The rise of iron also coincided with the development of more sophisticated lock mechanisms. Castles weren't just about defending against armies. They were about protecting treasure, storing food, and keeping royal families safe from harm. Iron locks were the security systems of the day. But what about the craftsmen who made all these tools? What did iron do for their livelihoods? Well, let's dive into the world of blacksmithing, because the medieval blacksmith was no mere tradesman. They were a cornerstone of medieval society. While today, when we think of a blacksmith, we often imagine a grizzled old man hammering away at a horseshoe. The reality was a little more entrepreneurial. Blacksmiths were essential for maintaining all sorts of equipment, from tools to weapons, armor to farm implements. They were, in many ways, the backbone of medieval society. In fact, blacksmiths had a certain level of social status, which is pretty wild when you think about it. A good blacksmith was in high demand, and their services were often bartered or exchanged for goods, land, or even prestige. You might find blacksmiths working alongside other craftsmen in a workshop or traveling to various towns to offer their services. If you were a village in medieval Europe, having a good blacksmith was pretty much a matter of life and death. You needed iron to survive, and you needed a blacksmith to turn that iron into useful tools. But the irony here is that blacksmiths weren't just revered for their work. They were also feared for their control over such a crucial resource. In a time when iron was one of the most valuable commodities, blacksmiths held real power. Historians still argue about how much this influence shaped the medieval economy. Some claim that blacksmiths were key players in the rise of early capitalism, while others argue that their influence was more localized. But wherever they worked, their ability to forge iron gave them a special kind of leverage over society. They held the keys to survival. And here's where things get truly mind-blowing. Medieval blacksmithing had a direct impact on the Industrial Revolution. You might think of the Industrial Revolution as something that happened in the 18th and 19th centuries, with factories and steam engines. But without the techniques and innovations of medieval blacksmiths, none of it would have been possible. The smelting processes, the ways of shaping metal, and the tools that were honed over centuries laid the groundwork for future industrial development. Without that foundational knowledge, the iron of the Industrial Revolution wouldn't have been as strong or as reliable. The medieval blacksmiths were, in a sense, the unsung heroes of the modern age. And while we may not rely on blacksmiths anymore, their influence still resonates in every piece of metal we use. From the cars we drive to the steel beams that hold up our skyscrapers, the legacy of medieval ironwork is embedded in every corner of modern life. Without their innovations, we wouldn't have the infrastructure, tools, or technologies that define the world we live in today. Historians still debate the exact role that medieval blacksmiths played in the evolution of technology. Were they the true forerunners of the Industrial Revolution? Or was their influence simply a stepping stone in the larger development of metallurgy? Regardless, one thing is clear. Medieval ironworking set the stage for the world we know now. And for that, we can thank those first humble blacksmiths who hammered away in their workshops, crafting not just tools and weapons, but the future. Okay, so by this point, we've traveled through the medieval forges, marveled at the durability of iron, and even touched on how these ancient techniques laid the groundwork for the modern world. But now it's time to pivot, because as much as iron shaped history, there's something equally fascinating about its decline in the face of newer technologies. Today, when you look at your rusting bike chain or your worn-out tools, you probably think, why can't modern iron hold up the way it used to? Well, the answer to that is rooted in a perfect storm of industrial advances, environmental shifts, and our ever-changing demands for materials. First, let's rewind a bit to the 19th century, the time of the Industrial Revolution. This was the period that saw the dramatic rise of steel over iron, as advancements in smelting and manufacturing allowed for mass production of stronger, more flexible materials. Steel, which is basically iron combined with a small amount of carbon, quickly became the material of choice for everything from railroads to skyscrapers to, eventually, automobiles. But what exactly was it about steel that made it better than medieval iron? It all comes down to something we take for granted today: the quality of iron. The iron used in medieval times was often impure, containing all sorts of contaminants that weakened the metal. While it could be tough and durable, it wasn't necessarily strong in the way that modern steel is. The breakthrough came with the development of the Bessemer process in the mid-19th century, a method that allowed for the mass production of steel by removing impurities from iron more efficiently. The resulting steel was not only stronger, but also more resistant to rust and corrosion. Historians still debate how much the transition from iron to steel shaped the course of the Industrial Revolution. Some argue that steel was the true catalyst, while others suggest that the innovations in ironworking set the stage for steel's rise. Either way, the fact remains: the arrival of steel revolutionized industries around the world. Suddenly, we were able to create lighter, stronger, and more flexible structures. Think about it. Your modern skyscraper is built with steel beams, not iron. Your car is made of steel, not iron. Even your kitchen appliances are often made with steel alloys. Iron, despite its historical significance, had to step aside as steel took over. But that doesn't mean iron disappeared. In fact, you're still surrounded by iron, especially in the form of cast iron. You know, those classic heavy-duty frying pans or the ornate gates that you might find outside of old buildings. That's cast iron. While cast iron was largely overshadowed by steel in terms of strength, it still had its place due to its versatility and durability. Cast iron can be poured into molds and cast into intricate shapes, making it perfect for decorative purposes as well as for practical uses like cooking and construction. One of the key reasons why cast iron remained popular in certain sectors, even after the rise of steel, was because of its ability to hold heat evenly, perfect for cooking. But it was also an easy material to produce in large quantities. Unlike steel, which requires higher temperatures and more specialized techniques to produce, cast iron could be mass-produced in large furnaces at relatively low costs. The fact that cast iron doesn't rust as quickly as wrought iron or raw steel was also an advantage, giving it a long-lasting presence in some industries. However, even in the case of cast iron, rust is still a problem, just not as quickly. So what happened to the high-quality, rust-resistant iron of the medieval period? Why doesn't your modern iron last as long as it should? Well, we got to look at a couple of factors, including the global shift towards mass manufacturing, the environmental pressures of the 20th century, and, of course, the increasing demands of modern material science. Let's start with the industrial mass production of iron and steel. Back in the medieval days, iron was produced in small quantities, often by individual blacksmiths or small workshops. This meant that the iron was carefully forged, shaped, and treated, often with the goal of ensuring longevity. Modern mass production, on the other hand, doesn't have the luxury of time or the personal care that medieval methods offered. Today, iron and steel are produced in enormous quantities, using methods that prioritize speed and cost-effectiveness over longevity. Mass-produced materials often come with more imperfections, more impurities, and, yes, more susceptibility to rusting. This mass production model means that while we have access to iron and steel in abundance, we've sacrificed some of the quality control that made medieval iron so special. In some ways, we've lost the human touch that ensured the metal was treated with care, resulting in products that don't last as long or stand up to the elements the way medieval iron did. Of course, this doesn't mean all modern iron is doomed to rust into oblivion. The 20th century brought about a host of new materials designed to combat rust, from galvanized steel, which is coated in a layer of zinc to prevent corrosion, to stainless steel, which includes chromium to make it rust-resistant. These advancements represent a huge leap forward in our ability to keep iron and steel from rusting. but the cost of some of the durability and craftsmanship that medieval ironwork boasted. But even stainless steel isn't foolproof. Modern steel might resist rust better than medieval iron, but it's still vulnerable to the effects of extreme conditions. Think about your car. Modern vehicles are often coated with rust-resistant paint, but over time, exposure to road salt, moisture, and harsh weather will take its toll. Even the best materials can't entirely escape the ravages of time. So what do we do about it? Modern scientists are still experimenting with ways to create iron and steel that can hold up to the harsh conditions of the modern world. From coating techniques to new alloys, engineers are finding ways to take the best aspects of medieval ironworking and combine them with the power of modern technology. But in many ways, we're still playing catch-up to the methods of the past. We may have the tools and knowledge to create materials that last longer, but we're still learning from the old ways of working iron, and, dare I say, rusting a little less along the way. Historians still debate whether the mass industrialization of iron and steel has led to a decline in material quality or whether it's simply a different approach to the same goal, durability. Some argue that we've traded quality for quantity, while others believe that modern methods are simply a more efficient, albeit imperfect, evolution. Either way, what's clear is that the relationship between iron, its preservation, and the demands of society is a complex and ever-evolving story. So, the next time you find yourself scrubbing away at a rusty bicycle chain, take a moment to reflect on the centuries of ironworking that have led to this very moment. The medieval blacksmiths, with their patinas of rust and magic, knew something about preservation that we're only beginning to rediscover. It's a delicate balance between forging the future and respecting the lessons of the past. And for all our technological advancements, we still have a long way to go to match the durability of iron that stood the test of time. Let's take a breather now, because we've been crisscrossing through the centuries of ironworking, from medieval forges to industrial revolution factories, and now we're about to dive into a truly unexpected twist in the iron story. Asterisk how the evolution of iron affects us today on a very personal level star. You might be thinking, wait, what's so personal about rust and iron? Well, stick with me, because the impact of iron on your daily life might be even closer than you realize. Whether you're conscious of it or not, the way we handle materials, how they last, how they corrode, and how we maintain them has deep-rooted consequences in the quality of life, health, and even our relationship with the planet. Iron is everywhere. We rely on it more than we probably ever notice. The infrastructure of our cities, the transportation systems we use, the homes we live in, even the technology we're using to listen to this right now. Iron and its alloys, steel, wrought iron, cast iron, have become the building blocks of modern civilization. You'd be hard-pressed to go through a day without encountering iron in one form or another. But here's where things get interesting. The very fact that iron is so ubiquitous means that rust is a constant, nagging issue. From bridges to appliances, rust is a silent enemy, eating away at structures and objects we take for granted. This brings us to a rather existential question. What does the inevitable decay of materials tell us about our own impermanence? Okay, I'm not here to give you a crisis of existence, but hear me out. In medieval times, the idea that iron could last centuries spoke to a certain sense of timelessness. Iron was strong, reliable, and stood as a symbol of endurance. In the modern world, however, the short lifespan of iron, whether in the form of rusting cars, tools, or industrial buildings, feels like a reminder that nothing lasts forever, not even the mightiest materials. And yet, there's more to this modern rust crisis than just philosophical musings. The rate at which materials rust today has a very real economic impact. Take, for example, the cost of maintaining infrastructure. The bridges you drive over, the pipelines that deliver water to your home, and even the oil rigs that keep the global economy churning. They all rely on iron and steel. But these metals, despite all our technological advancements, still rust over time. In fact, one of the leading causes of infrastructure failures worldwide is corrosion. Rust eating away at vital parts of our infrastructure, leading to costly repairs, catastrophic failures, and even fatalities. In the United States alone, the annual cost of corrosion on infrastructure is estimated to be in the hundreds of billions of dollars. And this is something you should care about, because unless you live in a desert or a climate where rust is an uncommon phenomenon, you are affected by it, whether you realize it or not. It's not just about your bike chain or that old wrench in your garage. It's about the steel in the bridges you cross, the water pipes in your home, and even the cars you drive. Think about the importance of maintaining your car. Now think about the thousands of bridges and structures nationwide that are constantly exposed to the elements. Every day, rust chips away at these systems, making them weaker and potentially dangerous. Governments and municipalities spend vast amounts of money just to combat rust through coating techniques, maintenance schedules, and replacement programs. And still, some of these systems break down faster than we can repair them. Here, the once sturdy materials of the past, such as wrought iron, which could last centuries if properly maintained, now crumble in the face of environmental stress and economic strain. But what's the solution? Well, that's a question we're still grappling with today. Engineers have come up with all sorts of ways to prevent rust, from applying anti-corrosion coatings to using more rust-resistant alloys like stainless steel. But, like we discussed earlier, these materials still aren't perfect, and many of them are often used for short-term solutions. Yes, stainless steel is better at resisting rust, but it's also more expensive and still can't avoid the inevitable wear and tear of time. It's a reminder that, as much as we like to think we've conquered rust, the world of material science is still playing catch-up with the ancient knowledge of medieval blacksmiths. After all, they knew that iron needed care and attention, that it had to be protected, treated, and maintained regularly. Sure, we've developed all kinds of advanced materials, but when you think about it, those medieval techniques had a certain longevity that we still haven't fully replicated. Now, this is where we come to another mind-boggling twist. How we interact with iron today is shifting as we move away from the reliance on the material for so many fundamental parts of our lives. We've already established that steel is the more dominant material, but there's an even more recent development: the move towards sustainable materials and a push for eco-friendly technologies. The Iron Age, yes, even the iron itself, is slowly making way for other, more sustainable materials. If you're thinking this sounds like a stretch, hear me out. One of the most exciting trends in modern construction and manufacturing is the use of recycled metals, specifically recycled steel and iron. Just like the ancient smiths reworked and reused old iron to create new tools, today's engineers are rethinking how to use iron more efficiently. Recycling not only reduces waste, but also lowers the need to mine new iron ore, which, as you can imagine, is both a costly and environmentally damaging process. This shift towards sustainable iron production is a significant step in addressing the environmental impact of rust and decay while still benefiting from the inherent strength and versatility of iron. In fact, iron recycling is one of the most energy-efficient ways to produce steel today. While smelting raw iron ore requires vast amounts of energy, recycling scrap metal requires far less energy, reducing emissions and conserving resources. In some ways, this modern recycling movement is a nod to the resourcefulness of medieval blacksmiths, who were able to take old tools and reforge them into new, functional pieces. We've come full circle. Only now, we're not just trying to make better, longer-lasting ironwork. We're also considering the planet in the process. Historians and material scientists still debate whether we've truly outgrown iron or whether we're just in the middle of a technological transition. Are we moving towards an iron-less world? Or are we simply finding new, sustainable ways to use this age-old material? Either way, one thing is clear: the legacy of iron is alive and well in the world of modern engineering. And just like the medieval blacksmiths, we're still figuring out the best way to preserve, protect, and make use of the materials that shape our lives. You might not notice it every day, but rust and iron still shape our world in ways we can't escape. The iron that once forged kingdoms, that built castles and swords, now holds up the roads we drive on and the buildings we live in. And as we continue to wrestle with the complexities of modern metallurgy, we can't help but acknowledge that iron, in all its rusty glory, is as much a part of our future as it was in the past. All right, we're getting close to the end of our journey, but before we wrap up, let's take a step back and talk about something that might seem a bit, well, unexpected. How the story of medieval iron relates to the world we live in today in a way we've never really considered before. You've heard about its use in battle, its dominance in construction, and its rusty decline, but here's the twist that'll really make you think. Iron, and the way we've used it, is deeply intertwined with our environmental crisis, and believe it or not, its legacy might hold some clues to solving the problems we're facing today. Let's start with the big, glaring issue: climate change. We all know the planet is warming, glaciers are melting, and our oceans are rising. But how does all of this tie back to medieval iron, you ask? It turns out that iron and steel have a massive impact on the carbon footprint of modern civilization. Remember how we talked about how iron is everywhere? Well, what you might not know is that producing steel today is one of the largest contributors to global greenhouse gas emissions. Traditional steel production, made by melting iron or in blast furnaces, is an energy-intensive process that releases massive amounts of CO2 into the atmosphere. Now, here's the kicker. Medieval ironworking, though far less efficient, didn't produce nearly as much pollution because the production was smaller scale, decentralized, and powered by local resources like wood or charcoal. It wasn't the industrialized, mass production system we use today that fills the atmosphere with pollutants. The medieval approach was slow, labor-intensive, and much greener by comparison, though you could argue it was sustainable more out of necessity than design. Still, it gives us an intriguing lesson on what localization and small-scale production could look like in a modern world. Fast forward to today, and we're seeing a movement to bring some of these ancient ideas into the modern world, albeit with a technological twist. What if we could find ways to produce steel and iron without generating massive carbon emissions? What if, instead of mining iron ore and blasting it in massive furnaces, we could recycle scrap metal in more energy-efficient ways, or even create new forms of sustainable steel that don't rely on fossil fuels at all? The good news is scientists are working on this. The rise of green steel is one of the most promising developments in modern metallurgy. You might have heard of hydrogen-based steelmaking, a process that uses hydrogen instead of carbon to reduce iron ore, potentially eliminating the CO2 emissions that traditionally come from iron production. It's still in the early stages, but if successful, it could revolutionize the way we make steel and drastically cut emissions. The focus now is to scale up these methods and make them commercially viable. And here's the part where it ties back to medieval iron again. Those same principles of reusing and recycling materials that were core to medieval blacksmithing are still being applied today. Blacksmiths of the past reused scrap iron, melted down old tools, and forged them into something new, an approach that's eerily similar to modern recycling efforts aimed at reducing our carbon footprint. Historians, environmental scientists, and metallurgists still argue whether this return to a more local and sustainable model of metal production is the best solution, or if we need to focus more on large-scale technological advances like electric furnaces or renewable energy-powered smelting. Some believe that even as we strive for efficiency, we'll need to balance it with the long-term health of the planet, something medieval ironworkers knew, whether consciously or not. The slower pace, the local sourcing of materials, the smaller-scale craftsmanship, all of these are concepts we're revisiting today as we search for solutions to the ecological challenges facing modern society. But the influence of iron doesn't stop there. While steel production is a major contributor to climate change, the flip side of this is the fact that iron is also central to efforts aimed at tackling climate change, specifically in the field of geoengineering. Yes, you read that right. In an unexpected twist, scientists are looking to iron as a potential tool to help reverse some of the damage done to our planet. One of the more experimental strategies being explored is called iron fertilization. The theory is this: by adding tiny amounts of iron to certain parts of the ocean, we could stimulate the growth of phytoplankton, which would, in turn, absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. It sounds like science fiction, but the idea has been tested with some promising results. Phytoplankton are responsible for a significant portion of the world's oxygen production, and by giving them a bit of an iron boost, they could theoretically help remove large amounts of CO2 from the air. Of course, there are still a lot of questions about the long-term effects of such a strategy, and it's by no means a silver bullet. But once again, we see the unexpected legacy of iron. This time, not in the form of rusting bridges or broken-down cars, but as a potential solution to the very climate issues caused by human industry. This brings us to one last philosophical tangent that ties the whole story together. What makes a material timeless? Iron, in all its forms, has been with us for thousands of years, shaping civilizations, defining industries, and even contributing to our environmental challenges today. But as we shift toward greener technologies and more sustainable practices, it's clear that iron, like many things in the past, will continue to evolve. Whether it's through cutting-edge steel production methods or innovative geoengineering projects, iron is going to remain an integral part of our future, one way or another. So, while you may find yourself swiping away at rust spots on your bike or fretting over the wear on your iron skillet, know that you're part of a much larger story. A story of perseverance, innovation, and humanity's ongoing relationship with materials that have shaped our world. From the blacksmith's forge to the factories of today, from the rusting bridges to the green steel of the future, iron's journey is far from over. And whether we're recycling it, rethinking how we make it, or even using it to combat climate change, the legacy of medieval ironworking will continue to impact the way we live and breathe on this planet. As we wind down, I want to take you on a slightly different detour, one that might feel a little more personal, but is absolutely essential to our story. Iron's legacy isn't just written in the great arches of castles or the rusting skeletons of steel bridges. It's embedded in the very fabric of human culture. Think about it. Iron is not just a material. It's a symbol, a representation of strength, resilience, and progress. And the fascinating thing is, this symbolism didn't just emerge out of nowhere. It was forged in the fires of medieval blacksmiths, warriors, and kings. For centuries, iron was a symbol of power. When we think of knights in shining armor or ancient swords, we're talking about iron. And yet, there's a particular kind of poetry in the fact that iron, despite being the strongest material of its age, was always subject to one of the most frustrating vulnerabilities of nature: rust. That's a pretty humbling thought. Imagine your greatest weapon, your greatest tool, something you depend on for survival, slowly being eaten away by time, by the very elements that helped forge it. Rust wasn't just a nuisance. It was a reminder that even the mightiest things can be undone by the simplest forces. And in a strange way, this reminds us of the fragility of all things, whether it's a sword, a castle, or an empire. Iron might have symbolized power and progress, but it was also a reminder that nothing in life is truly invincible. The knights who wielded iron blades knew that their weapons were only as strong as their care and maintenance. And the same goes for the castles they defended. Over time, even the most immovable fortresses will succumb to the forces of nature if left unchecked. This idea that strength is constantly in a battle with time is something that resonates throughout history. As you probably know by now, iron didn't just fade into obscurity. It endured. It was reworked, reshaped, and reinvented as the centuries rolled on. But what's interesting is how that relationship between humanity and iron has evolved. For the medieval world, iron wasn't just a tool. It was an anchor to the earth. It was something you could rely on, something that made the world feel solid and dependable. In our modern age, though, the relationship is a bit more complicated. We no longer see iron as the great conqueror of nature. It's now part of a larger, more complex narrative about sustainability, environmental impact, and the future of manufacturing. But before we dive too deep into that, let's take a quick look at how iron transitioned from being a symbol of war to a symbol of peace. Iron, as the backbone of swords and shields, was central to medieval conflict. But as the world moved forward, iron began to take on a new role. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, iron's role shifted into a symbol of industrial progress. It became the lifeblood of factories, railroads, and urban infrastructure, the material that enabled mass transportation and urbanization. Iron was no longer about building walls to keep enemies out, but about creating a more connected, faster, and ever-growing world. Think about the Industrial Revolution, and what comes to mind? Factories, yes. Machines, trains, even skyscrapers. But underneath all of those grand advancements, it was iron that provided the skeleton. Steel and iron were the materials that let human ingenuity create a new world. And when you look at something as modern as a high-rise building, you're seeing an evolution of medieval ironwork, but on a scale unimaginable to those first blacksmiths. They could only dream of such strength, such scale. Their iron was limited in size and shape, but today, our modern steel can stretch to the sky. Historians still argue about the true symbolic significance of iron through the ages. Some see it as a representation of humanity's mastery over nature, while others suggest it embodies the inherent struggle between human ambition and the inexorable passage of time. But whatever your perspective, iron has left its imprint on the world's consciousness, shaping everything from culture to philosophy to art. And here's the thing. As we dive into the era of green steel and sustainable manufacturing, iron symbolism takes on a new layer. Today, iron is no longer just a symbol of human conquest. It's becoming a symbol of human responsibility. Iron's future is intertwined with the future of the planet, and how we handle it will define whether this timeless material continues to represent strength, resilience, and sustainability, or whether it becomes a relic of an outdated and harmful industrial past. Let's pause for a second, though, and zoom out. Remember how we discussed the way rust would creep into the ironwork of medieval times, slowly eroding its strength? Well, the modern version of this, at least in the context of our environment, is the slow, creeping degradation of our natural resources, ecosystems, and climate. Just as a rusted blade becomes less effective over time, so too does our planet's ability to function if we continue to exploit natural resources without considering their long-term impact. In this sense, the symbol of rusted iron may reflect humanity's broader struggle against environmental degradation. But here's where it gets optimistic. Just as medieval blacksmiths learned how to repair, care for, and even prevent rust in their iron, we too can repair and rebuild our relationship with the planet. The lessons of sustainability, of slowing down and making things last, are deeply embedded in the ancient knowledge of metallurgy. Maybe we're not doomed to repeat the mistakes of the industrial age. Perhaps we can create a new age of metalworking, one that fuses the ancient wisdom of iron preservation with cutting-edge, sustainable technologies. Iron is still at the heart of this movement. From sustainable manufacturing practices to innovations in recycling and green steel, we have the potential to reforge our future and, in the process, ensure that this material, which has been so central to human progress, continues to serve us in ways that honor the earth, just as it once honored the people who shaped it. Historians often debate whether the rise of industry was an inevitable part of human progress or a direction we took in pursuit of growth at any cost. But what seems clear is that, while we can't undo the past, we have the opportunity to reshape the future. As iron remains part of the world we're building, we must decide whether we'll continue to make it a symbol of endless growth or whether we'll turn it into a symbol of sustainable, thoughtful innovation, a new era of iron, shaped by care, not corrosion. Iron may have started as a weapon, a tool, a symbol of might, but it's also a symbol of our responsibility. And as we enter a new age of iron and steel, that symbolism could well become the key to a future where we don't just forge stronger materials, but stronger, more sustainable connections with the planet and with each other. We're almost at the end of our journey now, but before we wrap everything up, there's something worth reflecting on: the cultural significance of iron in the medieval world. It's easy to think of iron as just a material for tools, weapons, and infrastructure, but in the medieval period, it represented far more. Iron had a symbolic presence that stretched beyond its practical applications. and its role was deeply intertwined with beliefs, rituals, and the very worldview of medieval society. First off, let's talk about the sheer reverence for iron as a magical, almost mystical substance. Medieval people believed that iron had unique qualities, sometimes divine or supernatural. Iron was often associated with protection. People thought that it had the power to ward off evil spirits, demons, and other malevolent forces. This wasn't just some quaint superstition. It was a serious belief woven into daily life. Iron nails were often driven into the doorposts of homes to keep witches away, and iron keys were used to secure doors, symbolizing the power to shut out evil. Iron's significance as a protective force extended to its use in armor. You probably know by now that iron was the metal of choice for medieval knights and soldiers, whether in the form of chainmail or full suits of plate armor. But there's more to it than just practicality. Armor made of iron wasn't just meant to protect the body. It was also a way to protect the soul. The idea that a knight's armor shielded them from harm was almost as important as the physical protection it provided. After all, knights were seen as warriors of divine purpose, defenders of the realm, and even, in some cases, the church. To be clad in iron was to be granted the strength of a warrior and the divine favor of the gods. Of course, the symbolic importance of iron didn't stop at armor. The use of iron in medieval weaponry, swords, spears, and arrows, had its own mystique. The sword, especially, was seen as more than just a weapon. It was an extension of the knight's very soul, a symbol of honor, power, and duty. A fine sword forged from high-quality iron was prized not just for its sharpness and durability, but for its connection to the noble ideals of knighthood. Some swords even had their own names, passed down through generations, and were regarded as family heirlooms, capable of granting their wielders protection and prestige. The idea of forging a sword was a kind of sacred art, a process that turned mere metal into an object of almost religious importance. Iron also found its way into the realm of the spiritual. Iron was used in the making of crosses, chalices, and other religious artifacts. In the Christian context, iron became a symbol of both sacrifice and divinity. The nails of Christ's crucifixion, for example, were believed to be made of iron, and in many medieval depictions of the Passion, the iron nails will be shown as symbols of Christ's suffering and the redemption of humanity. These associations, too, elevated iron from being just a metal to a conduit for sacred power and divine symbolism. Its very weight seemed to carry with it an ancient truth, a connection to something larger than the world of man. Let's not forget that iron also had its place in medieval alchemy and mysticism. Alchemists, those medieval proto-scientists trying to turn lead into gold, were deeply fascinated by metals. And iron, with its associations to both the material and the spiritual realms, had a significant role. In the alchemical tradition, iron was seen as a prime material for transformation. It was often linked to the planet Mars, the god of war, aggression, and action. Alchemists believed that working with iron could unlock deeper, more hidden properties of the universe. Some even thought it was possible to purify and refine iron into something even more powerful and rare, like gold. These alchemical experiments might sound a bit outlandish today, but they were serious pursuits in their time, and they underscore how iron was seen not just as a practical resource, but as something with profound metaphysical significance. So, iron in the medieval world wasn't just about practicality. It was wrapped in layers of myth, magic, and meaning. It wasn't just a tool. It was a force, something that connected the physical world with the divine, the earthly with the celestial. And this belief in the symbolic power of iron, in its ability to protect, to transform, and to elevate, permeated all levels of medieval society. Whether it was the swords wielded by warriors, the nails in the doors of humble homes, or the crosses held in the hands of priests, iron was seen as something that had the power to shape the destiny of men, protect the soul, and even connect humanity with the divine. It's interesting to think about how we view iron today in comparison. Sure, it's still a symbol of strength, but we no longer imbue it with the mystical qualities that medieval people did. Today, It's more of a utility material, strong, reliable, and foundational, but not necessarily magical. And yet, there's a quiet irony in the fact that, even in our more secular, scientifically minded world, we still rely on iron for the most important aspects of our lives. It's still a foundational material in the modern world, just as it was in the medieval era. Maybe it's not magic, but its constant presence in the things that shape our lives. Our homes, our cities, our vehicles is a quiet form of magic in itself. Historians and cultural scholars still debate whether the medieval fascination with iron reflects an intrinsic connection between humanity and the material world, or whether it was a projection of the medieval mind's desire to create meaning from the things around them. Was iron sacred because it was durable and central to survival, or because people genuinely believed it carried mystical powers? It's hard to say, but one thing is certain. Iron's place in human history is not just as a material, but as a cultural icon. What's fascinating now is that iron is making its comeback in a new form, one that can be seen as a symbol of something greater: sustainability. The environmental revolution taking place in the world of metallurgy, the movement toward recycling iron and reducing its carbon footprint, is like a modern-day alchemy. It's the attempt to turn the rust of industrialization into something new, something that will protect both people and the planet. The idea of using iron in a way that respects the environment echoes that medieval relationship. It's a material that protects, that endures, that helps shape a better world. Iron may no longer be wrapped in the heavy mantle of superstition and divine favor, but its enduring presence in human civilization and its potential for positive transformation still make it a symbol, this time of resilience and hope, rather than just strength or conquest. Now that we've come full circle, let's slow down and reflect on everything we've uncovered in this journey. From the mighty forges of the medieval blacksmiths to the shimmering steel of modern skyscrapers, iron has always been more than just a metal. It's been a witness to human history, a symbol of our triumphs and failures, a material that shapes our cities, our weapons, our lives. And even now, as we wrestle with the future of sustainability, iron remains a cornerstone of progress. In a way, iron is the perfect metaphor for the human experience. Strong, resilient, but vulnerable to the passage of time. Like the knights whose swords rusted in the damp castles, or the castles themselves that crumbled under centuries of weather and wear. We too face the challenge of preservation. And just as medieval ironworkers had to adapt to new methods of forging and maintaining their weapons, we too must find new ways to sustain the resources that keep our modern world intact. Iron's history, from the ancient smelting pits to the industrial furnaces of the 19th century, reminds us that no matter how advanced we become, we are always engaged in a balancing act between creation and decay. But here's the thing. Iron, unlike so many other materials, has always been something we can recycle. Its ability to be melted down, reforged, and reborn is perhaps the greatest lesson it offers us. While other metals or materials can be consumed and lost to history, iron always finds a way to come back. This is exactly what we're seeing today with the rise of green steel and sustainable manufacturing. Just like the blacksmiths who carefully salvaged every scrap of iron, modern industries are looking at ways to reforge the future, using less energy, fewer resources, and minimizing their environmental impact. And while we're talking about iron's potential for renewal, don't forget the symbolism that iron still holds for us. It's not just about tools or infrastructure, it's about creating something that lasts. In a world of disposable consumer culture, iron reminds us that enduring things built to last, have a value that goes beyond the superficial. Iron's value isn't just in its strength. It's in its ability to endure, to persist through time. Maybe that's something we need to reclaim in our own lives. The idea that the things we create, whether in our relationships, our work, or our planet, should have the durability and sustainability that iron has shown through history. And here's the kicker. Even in its rusted form, iron carries a kind of beauty. There's something poetic about the way rust transforms the surface of metal. turning what was once bright and sharp into something soft and worn, yet still beautiful in its own way. Rust doesn't erase iron. It changes it, makes it part of the natural world, linking it to the cycle of life and decay. In the same way, life isn't about avoiding decay, but about understanding and accepting it as part of the process. We don't need to fear aging, change, or impermanence. Instead, we can embrace it just as iron continues to do, constantly reformed, constantly evolving. Iron's story isn't over. The journey we've taken through time, from the humble blacksmiths of medieval Europe to the towering skyscrapers of today and the promises of a greener future, shows that this material is far from outdated. If anything, iron is now being reborn in new forms, learning to exist in harmony with the environment, while still holding on to its ancient legacy of strength and resilience. It's up to us, the modern world, to continue forging the path ahead, finding ways to honor iron's past while shaping its future. So, as you settle in for the night, take a moment to reflect on iron's quiet, enduring presence in your own life. Whether it's the iron in your old bike frame, the steel of a cooking pot, or the beams of a building down the street, iron is there, always in the background, holding everything together, even when we don't notice it. And just like the blacksmith's hammer ringing in the forge, iron is still being shaped, still being worked, still working for us. Now, dim the lights, take a deep breath, and let the hum of this quiet story settle in with you. Just like the rust that patiently forms on iron over the years, may this moment of reflection gently age within your mind, fading into a peaceful stillness. And so, our story comes to an end. Thank you for listening.